Somebody just tried to reset my Microsoft password.
Wait, what?
What the hell? Was it you?
I don't even know what email address your Microsoft password would be attached to.
Well, apparently somebody does.
Look, man, people reset my Google password 4 or 5 times a day.
Well, yeah, let's say you occupy a bit of an edge case.
It's a problem, okay?
I think we've covered this before.
I couldn't remember if we had or not. But okay, so who? Look, I gotta imagine your Xbox. You've got threat profile there.
So that address got out on streams years and years ago. The funny thing is, so I just noticed what was actually the case is Microsoft. I don't think, does anybody else do this? Microsoft lets you specify an email address different than your actual email address on that account.
You can do that with Google.
As the email address to send backup or to send recovery codes, reset requests to.
No, because then if you were locked out of the account, how would you get the reset address?
You're totally right. But in my case, it went the opposite direction of I changed the email address from one that had been public to one that was private, but did not realize I also needed to separately update the recovery address, the password reset email along with that. So they were able to still punch the address everybody knows into a thing.
Oh, because it's still the recovery address.
Right. So in my case, it worked against me is what I'm saying.
Well, that's a problem.
Yeah, that's not great.
I once had to reset my Microsoft password before a Thursday Night Throwdown because it was using a password that was in it, that Gizmodo hack or something,
a
Gawker hack.
Okay.
And somebody was logging into it from Malaysia someplace.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's the thing that happened.
It's a skeezy feeling. Do you agree? It
feels awful.
It makes your skin crawl a little bit to think that somebody is trying to get into your thing.
It feels like an actual violation.
It really does.
Yeah.
Let's bring this all together here. Can I tell a little known giant bomb story?
Oh, yeah, always.
Since you mentioned Thursday Night Throwdown and we're talking about accounts getting compromised, let's just tie this all together. Someone there who will, I guess I won't name and shame, used the same password for their giant bomb account that they had used apparently everywhere else.
Oh, boy.
And it got compromised in one of those hacks, just like that Gizmodo hack you were just talking about. Somebody got into their account, and of course they had back-end full staff CMS access.
Oh, crap.
We only found this out. They didn't get in there. So this was, I have to, as nefarious as this was, I have to admire their ingenuity or their insidiousness. They didn't go in there and upload a bunch of porn onto the site and make it the top slot all over the front page.
It would have been hard to figure that out, in fairness.
What they did was go pull up a bunch of old reviews and old articles and just very subtly go through and insert a bunch of profanity, in the most inconspicuous way. They just inserted single swear words in the middles of paragraphs of a bunch of different reviews and stuff. They very, very carefully and meticulously vandalized a bunch of reviews. And it took quite a while, I think, for somebody to catch on to that. Eventually access logs were queried or, whatever activity was tracked. And it was, I assume, fairly trivial to roll that stuff back. But for quite some time, it took a while to discover the wrongdoing.
This is my favorite kind of vandalism. Somebody came to Adam's shop one time when they were visiting Tested. And I want to say it was Peter Sagal, but it might have been Paul and Storm. I can't remember who. And he had all of the drawers on his bazillions of toolboxes everywhere. And they were all labeled with a label maker. And the label maker usually was just hanging on a hook in the shop. Because when he would put something new in a drawer, he'd make a new label and stick it on there. So you could just kind of scan the drawers and find out what it was. And so whoever this was took the label maker and just put some gag ones that were left-handed spanners and stuff like that. But then they also made ones that were much, much worse, that were just slight typos on the existing labels. And they put them right on top of the existing labels and then didn't say a word. We didn't realize it for weeks. And I was like, Adam, you can't spell for shit.
This was the technique of the East German Stasi, right?
What, really? They would just
to psychologically manipulate people without their knowledge until they just basically lost their marbles.
Oh no.
Wait, hang on. Are you friends with the secret police?
welcome to Brad and Will Made a Tech Pod. I'm Will.
I'm Brad.
And we have a very special guest today joining us from what looks like the basement of CERN, somewhere in a beam path, is one Chris DeBona. Chris, welcome to the show. How you doing, man?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me. This is going to be fun. Or not. Maybe really awful. But, I'm looking forward to it.
You'll find out in 45 minutes.
If it's not fun, we'll just play with the particle accelerator. And
right? Yeah. Throw some muons.
So, Chris, people may know you from your work, let's say a while ago on Slashdot.
Yeah.
But for the last 15-ish, 17 years.
Yeah.
You've been the open source licensing compliance person for Google.
Sounds so institutional. Sounds so bureaucratic.
So technically, my title is the director of open source for Alphabet and Google. And I had some other stuff on my title, but honestly, I've had two titles at Google. First was the open source programs manager. Then they promoted me to director. So I was like, oh, I should change my title. And so I became the director.
Did you get a fancy chair with like the fold up arms and the canvas back or anything like that?
You'd think there'd be like a special watch or a special handshake. It's not really how it works.
No. Okay. Well, that's disappointing, but I'll allow it. So director of open source, what do you do, Chris?
So I have sort of a tripartite job.
Okay. That means there's three parts, I believe.
Sure.
Okay.
So actually I have a multifaceted job. So I look after, and when I say I mean, I have a team of like 60 people. Okay.
Wow.
Okay.
So I have, a mission to look after all the incoming source code in the company, make sure that Google is able to release source code from the company. And then also I have this really privileged position to have the overall health of the open source community as one of my missions, right? So I'm about a year or two into my job, maybe a year into my job, one of our founders asked me to look after computer scientists over the summer in school. And so I was like, well, I guess my meeting now also includes, the health of these students and the health of the open source software community that has created so much value for Google.
Yeah,
and so it's kind of great, and then I do some stuff in policy but it's fine.
So like that XKCD, the one about the one project that some random person in Nebraska has been thanklessly maintaining since 2003, that is the prop upon which the entire software stack for the internet is based. Like, does that mean that person falls under your domain now?
Yeah. No. So you laugh, but one of the things that sort of happens in open source about every 6 months, somebody freaks out and they go, open source isn't a good living. And so my goal is that I've already spoken with them about how to have a good living, or how to not do open source anymore. And make sure that they know that Google is there for them proportionally. So for instance, a good example of this, the network time daemon was one of these, NTP was one of these sort of ignored pieces of software for years, right? And so for about 7 or 8 years, Google is the only one funding Harlan and his work on it, And it's the same thing with SSL. People were like, "Oh, nobody cares about OpenSSL." About SSL, and it's like, well, we've actually had Ben Laurie working at Google for like 15 years now. And then when Heartbleed happened, we were the discoverers of it, and we were the ones who, I actually sent a guy to a marina to find Steve and to get him talking to us. And we tried to clean up the licensing situation inside SSL. And, so yeah, we don't talk about a lot of this stuff publicly, but I do talk, and my team, we talk directly with these developers all the time so that at least they know that they have a friend at Google. So.
But it seems like a place to make an impact.
Yeah. And it's my thing, it's funny because people are like, oh, this is a great job. You run an open source, blah, blah. And I'm like, what it really is? It's maintaining a relationship with a completely changing moving target of a community, right? Because the community needs to change, right? If I think back 25 years ago, how many of those people are going to be around 25 years from now, 10 years from now, 5 years from now, right? It's not that they're just aging out, but it's unreasonable to expect somebody to maintain some piece of software for 10 years absent a commercial benefit or a personal benefit,
Yeah, even with that, like, how many people do you know that have kept the same job for 10 years? Like, done the same job for 10 years? It's unusual.
Very few. It's funny because I was talking to one of my teammates, one of my employees, and they were going to be looking in another area at Google, or maybe outside, but I'm thinking of Google, and they're like, "Wow, I'm really surprised that you're so supportive of this." And I'm like, "You've worked for me for many years. Of course I'm going to be supportive of it. It's like, the number of people who work for me for their whole lives is going to be measured as a zero."
Yeah.
Right. I've seen employees come work for me, leave working for me, come back and work for me, whether it's working for me inside Google, outside Google. It's like when I came to Google, I brought like 5-6 people from VA Linux with me. Cause it's just like, when you find really good people that you like to work with, you want to help them. You want to help them find a better job, or a job with more runway if that's what they're looking for, whatever it might be.
Okay. So Brad, we have open source licensing questions here.
Yes, we have we have a bulleted list here. Should I just start reading acronyms?
Sure, let's do it.
All right, GPL, LGPL, BSD, CDDL.
So, do you want like the background on where they came from, how Google feels about them?
So they're kind of all of the above. But go ahead, Will.
But I was going to say our remit on the podcast is to take things that people hear about and know kind of what they are, but don't really. And like, I don't want to do the explain it like I'm 5 explanation, but like, we want to get into like a little bit of the differences and like what the nuances are and the things that like what do I need to understand as a user of software when I put GPL software on my computer versus MIT software versus CDDL versus BSD versus some other license that I'm sure I've forgotten. And I realize like this is a big topic, right? There's a lot to it, kind of. But on the other hand, maybe there's not at all because I can just run whatever software I want on my computer. And it works itself out.
Well, remember, So I'm a bureaucrat. Okay, I'm a very proud, efficient bureaucrat. All right, my goal is to help developers use software with as little red tape and stickiness as possible. Okay, so when somebody at Google or when somebody outside Google says, "Hey, I want to use this line of code or this library or this program from Google or from outside Google," I say, "Okay, what's the license say?" And we make this very, very efficient. So what I'd say is, if you want to talk about licenses, right, you should talk about how do people think about licenses when they're in my position, so they can make a more efficient decision about what to do. And it all comes down to, well, what do you want to do with it? Right? If you just want to like install it on your personal, computer there in wherever the hell you guys are, you're in Sin City and Palm Springs, wherever you're at, right? If you're not going to be redistributing that code, you don't have to care about anything, right? There's very few people who have to give any craps about code that never gets expressed to a customer or a client or a partner or something. So, how do you accommodate that for a user is different than how you would accommodate it for a Google, right? Because if somebody wants to use a library from outside the company, I have to assume as a regulator that it's going to end up in a shipping product somewhere, right? Because of the way that we've done our repositories inside the company, right? So what we say to them is we have, okay, are you following our other standards around how to build software, how to bring software into the company? We have areas in the software repositories called third party, where all non-written by Google or code must go. And then we give them the training. We give them all the reasons to do things right, so that when it comes time to launch a service, search, ads, Gmail, cloud products, Android, Chromium, you name it, that the answers are already baked in to their build. Right. So you say, Go ahead.
No, so they build the software, and then they hit the button, and your tool says, "Okay, here's the external code that's in this product." At that point, is it that easy?
It's almost that easy, right?
Okay.
So it's very easy for a Googler to find out what code is being expressed in their product, so they understand what kind of launch requirements are associated with the software they're using. But more importantly, when they bring the code into their code base in the first place, there are standards applied to that code. So for instance, if a person working on Android wants to bring in a library and it's under the GPL, right? It's like, okay, there are places in Android where GPL code is allowed and there are places that is not, right? So if you're in the systems layer, LGPL and GPL code is generally pretty okay. The carriers don't have a huge problem with complying. We don't have any problems with complying in our Pixel line. And so that can be all right, but if it's like inside what you consider the Android open source operating system, if it's in that part of the code base, we require permissively licensed code. So that would be BSD, that would be Apache, that would be those sorts of things, which we chose specifically because carrier consumers, chipset makers, the whole thing, they could understand GPL compliance for the kernel, but past that was never going to happen, right? So when we chose these licenses for Android, it was because we thought, okay, what are the developers of Android-based systems going to need? What are they going to be able to comply with? What are they asking for? And what do we need from them, right? We're trying to build out this platform. We're trying to extend this platform out to as many people on Earth as possible. So that tells me we need an extremely permissive patent granting license so that they don't worry about us coming to them later and taking from them rent-seeking patent fees. Right?
It's funny. I'd never thought about it, but it makes total sense that like when you make licensing decisions on something like Android that then goes out to hundreds of partners around the world or thousands of partners around the world, that there are then follow-on requirements for them.
Oh, yeah.
For all of the, like Samsung makes their changes and they have to then kick stuff down the stream. And that's a terrifying level of complexity.
Well, the thing is, you have to realize though, when Samsung ships a phone, it's not my problem, but I want to minimize their problems because I want Android to be successful. Similarly, when we were choosing licenses for Chrome and Chromium, which is the open source components of Chrome, we decided on BSD with actually a written second patent grant for some of the components like the codecs and the rest. And the reason we did that was because BSD was compatible with the Mozilla Tri license, where they have like everything that Mozilla was working on at the time, I think still, was under this triple license of the NPL, the MPL, and something else. And then it was compatible with WebKit. So any WebKit consuming browser could use anything we wrote forever, and it was obviously compatible with what would become Chromium. But the idea was that what we wanted to do with Chromium was bring desktop-like interactions. We wanted to advance HTML5 and JavaScript to the point where it could be doing things like Gmail, doing things like all these crazy Jitsi stuff, right? And the only way we could do that is if all browsers could advance, right? So, anyways, I'm yammering a lot. I apologize. But that's why we picked BSD, because everyone can consume BSD. Not everyone can consume Apache, but everyone can consume BSD. This is why you see, I think it's MIT and BSD as being the most popular licenses for JavaScript, because everyone can consume it. And the people who work in JavaScript, their attitude was typically, I don't want to have to deal with any of this crap, right? And so they're like, what's the easiest way? I don't even want to use copyright. And it's like, well, you kind of don't have a choice. And they're like, fine, I'll just use MIT. Screw you guys, right? And that's what they would do, right? Because MIT is a tested license that lawyers understand, and you're not going to expose yourself. It's got a warranty clause. There's all these things. I could put up on the screen here, if you wanted, my how to walk through a software license slide that I give from time to time. And I won't do that. But it's one of those things where the licenses are very clear in what they expect of you if you were to redistribute them. And so that's the northern light for us.
Yeah, it might be. I think it might be useful to step back and just define a couple of terms and concepts for listeners who don't understand. Like a software license simply delineates your obligations under using that source code, right?
It's simpler than that. So first of all, let's just tell everyone what copyright is. When you create something, copyright is already attached. Okay, you don't necessarily have to register it with the federal government or your local government if you're overseas. And also, if you're in what's called a WIPO signatory country, copyright continues to attach even after you release it. For second sales, for moral rights, there's all this complicated crap. But the long and short of it is that copyright attaches when you do a creative, unique work. And now a license to a piece of copywritten creation, okay, is a very simple thing that says, here's what you can do with this creative work. When you do, here's when you do that thing with that creative work, then you have an obligation that is the follow, right? So every software license, and then there's often what's called a warranty clause or a disclaimer of warranty after that, which says, and since you've chosen to use this software under the terms of which I've released it to you, you also agree not to sue me over that use or some alternative use that you've come up with. And so every software license, whether it's commercial, open source, whatever, has those sections. And in the first section, it's called the articulated rights of a software license. And there's 7 of them. It's like use, fold, spindle, mutilate, use, modify, distribute, et cetera, et cetera. And so, and then in return, in a software license, it'll say something like, you need to pay me per thread if you're Oracle. Or you need to pay me per copy run per desk, or for how many users in your company. So they have like all these terms. In open source licenses, it says when you distribute this to a person outside of your company, and a user, right? When a user downloads this software or uses the software after you've delivered it to them, you agree to do the following, right? And most open source software licenses, they have a couple of things that they say. Almost all of them say you have to acknowledge the use of this software. So if you go to Android Legal about licenses, open source, you'll find a list, a mile long of software that's used in that operating system. So you have to acknowledge use of the software. You have to sometimes share code connected to this software. Or share the code of the software you're using and any changes you made just to that module. And that's inherently every open source software license looks like that. And some of them define distribution in different ways. Like they'll say, hey, it's only distribution if you download it as part of a package to like your Windows, Linux, Macintosh. Or they'll say if you download this app as an app onto your phone, well, then you should, comply with the license. That's distribution. And there's also a class of licenses that say if you display it over a network connection, that's distribution. And that's these are the newer open source licenses, like the AGPL, which stands for Affero. Affero was a content management company, and they didn't want anyone using their content management system and shipping it to their customers without giving them patches. Right, which was very common in the cloud business.
So it seems like a lot of this. I mean, did this start with the BSD license, or did this start with the GPL,
the first licenses were the MIT and BSD license.
Okay,
and then the GPL came, I think, shortly after MIT and BSD, or shortly before. I'd have to go back to my notes. If there's one person that you should learn more about from a license creation perspective, there's really 2 people. There's Hal Abelson at MIT, and there's who would I credit the BSD to? Not Eric Allman, but maybe Eric. Yeah. So the BSD license was basically created because, and I'm going to say this as nicely as I can, they didn't want to use that filthy East Coast crap. Right, they wanted something that would work for the UC system, right? So Eric and other folks, I think they petitioned the regents of the University of California to come up with something that they could use that wasn't from MIT, and so yeah.
Oh gosh, I you know, I'm not afraid to say I have spent enough time looking at FreeBSD source code that the Regents of the University of California is a phrase that is burned into my brain.
Right?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Well,
and it's really funny too because like so it probably was Bill Joy petitioning the Regents. If I had to guess, it was Bill Joy and some of his pals, and this is before they went off to Sun and the rest, right? So
I mean, do all these licenses, like this cascade of licenses that proliferated over the last 25 years, 30 years, is this all to close loopholes in the, you know, like the distributing code over a network is like a JavaScript or a virtual computer thing? And
well, it's not. So the reason the people who embraced the AGPL were people who you saw it being embraced by database creators, by CRM creators, who, frankly, the experience they had when they were developing under the GPL was that competitors would use their software and they wouldn't patch, they wouldn't support, they would just try to undercut them on cost. And so they came up with the AGPL. Turns out that doesn't do it either, because, you know, cloud providers are very handy at releasing patches, you know, and the interpretation of the AGPL has been such that providers like, I think it's MongoDB and Elastic and the rest, they've embraced these server-side public licenses and basically they're commercial licenses, right? So because they say if you're a cloud provider, you can't use our software, and like these other people can. It's like, well, you know, in the open source world, you know, the grandparents of open source, one of the things we always were reticent about was when people would try to use open source software licenses and free software licenses to restrict behavior of human beings. So sorry, I don't know if you care about this history, but back in the mid 90s, okay, because a lot of people said, well, why don't you write in a clause that says you're not going to do evil with your software that you release, or that it kind of, you know,
difficult to enforce.
And where this came from was a very idealistic set of developers, and they added a clause to the MIT license at the time, I believe. And it was basically, this cannot be used in nuclear power plants or in nuclear weapons. They were very against nuclear weapons, which is a very nice thing for someone to be against, right? Nobody likes nuclear weapons, right? So they didn't want their software going into nuclear weapons. And I remember looking at that and I was like, huh. And the way they portrayed it was that there's a lot of regulation around software for nuclear power plants and for the military. So, you know, open source people shouldn't worry their pretty little heads about such things. But what it was is they were pacifists and they didn't want their work ending up in weapons. And so we're all like, huh, that's interesting. And then somebody did a license that was, again, I think it was MIT or BSD, and they added on a clause that it could not be used by the state of Israel in their ongoing pogrom against the Palestinians. And then somebody said, this software is not to be used by abortion clinics. And then we started seeing worse restrictions, frankly, racist and things that I really don't want to talk about.
Pretty quickly. Yeah.
Yeah, so things went bad really quickly. So the grandparents of open source, we all got together at probably in a rally conference, and we said, we got to put the brakes on this stuff, right? And so this is when the Open Source Initiative was created, and their goal was to be the standards bearer for what was and was not open source and free software. And one of the things that they came up with is they started with the Debian free software guidelines, and they created the open source definition from it. And it says, you will not indulge in field of use restrictions of this type, right? And so that kind of lasted for 20 years. And then we started seeing a couple of do no evil licenses like jQuery and some, this is to be used for good and not evil. But I said to IBM and Google that they could do whatever they want. It's like, okay, that's great. And then we saw some the WTFPL, you know, which is the do whatever you effing want public license.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is it's actually not a license. It's not articulated in a way that's defendable. It doesn't articulate the 7 rights that you need. And it also doesn't have a warranty clause. So you could get sued and they could win if they use your software and it causes some injury or some perceived economic injury. So, yeah. Anyway.
So I was going to ask.
I'm sorry, I'm yammering. You got me monologuing. You know,
no.
like
this is why we brought you here because
like a villain in a bad TV show.
Look, Chris. I've had these conversations with you for breakfast multiple times. So it's so where is the? At what point is this legally defended? And at what point does Google say, "Hey, like"? I guess it's a two-parter. One is, do you have a list of licenses that you're just like, okay, here you do this, and you pull down the drop down and you put the code in the external repository and it just works itself out? And then how do you evaluate? Is it that it has to pass legal tests? Is it that you have to run it through the lawyers? Like, what's the process for that?
So I'm sort of a weird organization at Google in that we're not part of the legal team, but we have lawyers working for us. I don't report to Kent Walker or Halima, our general counsel, but I still set standards on what's acceptable for release of copyright. So I like to think that I have a very tight relationship with our copyright counsel, our patent counsel, our lead copyright counsel, our lead patent counsel, and our general counsel, so that I can continue to provide to the engineering staff and to the product people an efficient method for software development. Right. And I think I've lost track of your question.
So at what point is it legally license legally tested enough that you're like, okay, we can use this?
So here's the thing, right? So this will sound really imperial, by the way, and I apologize to anyone who's offended by that kind of statement. I make those decisions, right? So I was hired by Google to be the person who decides what's acceptable to bring into the company and to release from the company. And so I'm the heat shield. I'm the one who has to get deposed. I'm the one who gives support through me and my teams to like the Oracle lawsuit and the rest. And we're also the ones that have helped fund the defense of open source licenses in these non-Google contexts through various organizations like the Software Freedom Conservancy and the Apache Foundation, the Linux Foundation, right? So it comes down to what we wanted.
I was going to say, because it's always there are often, not always, but there've been a long series of court cases about this stuff over the last 25 years, right?
Have been, but it's important to judge risk appropriately. Okay. So there's been lawsuits, but a lot of people are like, but what about the SCO lawsuit? What about the Microsoft Java lawsuit? Those are not what you think they are. So the Oracle lawsuit was interesting because there was no contract between Oracle and Google. So it was really about the nature of copyright and its application to computer interfaces, .h files, and the rest, right? And that's it. It took us 13 years to finally get to the Supreme Court the second time.
Can you do a quick refresher on Oracle? Okay. Oracle v. Google.
So Oracle.
This is the one that just happened in the last year, is that right? Or that just hit the Supreme? Yeah,
it finally settled out in April. It was my longest running litigation hold. It was kind of sad when it ended. But so what happened was we released Android, and Android uses the Java programming language to implement applications, and the app. What you think of as Android is basically written in the Java programming language. And then we had what was called the Dalvik virtual machine when we launched, and that turned into ART. That turned into ARC. So we had an evolution of virtual machines that would run bytecode generated from that software. Okay, and because at the time, Java, frankly, was not suitable to run on mobile devices. J2ME was not featureful enough to run securely on a modern device. And so much in the same way as we made changes to the Linux kernel so it could run on a mobile platform efficiently and not destroy your battery, we had to have our own virtual machine for running this Java bytecode. Now, Sun sold to Oracle. Oracle sued us, saying that we had expropriated Java, specifically a group of code called TimSort, and that all of our use of the headers violated their copyright as well. And so, it started as a patent lawsuit, but they threw that out pretty much immediately. And then it turned into a copyright lawsuit. And so the TimSort stuff was hilarious because what had happened was Josh Block, who used to work on Java at Sun, had come to Google in like 2004, and he had rewritten TimSort to be more efficient. And it's literally 11 lines of code. Okay. But he had rewritten TimSort to be more efficient. And then we gave that to the Java community process for inclusion in Java. But we also gave it to Apache Harmony, which was a competing library set. And so when we included Apache Harmony in Android, they're like, haha, we have caught you using TimSort from Java. And it's like, and here's where my job kicks in. I'm like, no. Let me tell you where that code came from, because I am the janitor who looks after all the code. So I say, let's find out if this is really true, right? Because if it's true, well, we got to deal with the consequences of that. But let's find out. So we went back and we're like, okay, where did TimSort come from? Oh, it came from Harmony. Okay, let's go into Harmony. Where did Harmony get it? Oh, it came from Josh Block. Oh, really? Wasn't Josh working for us? Oh, he's still working for us? Let's make sure that we understand how it got into Harmony and JCP. Oh, and Java through the JCP. And it's like, it's completely reasonable because in my email, he had emailed me saying, hey, I want to release something to Harmony and the JCP at the same time. Should I? And I'm like, yeah, do it. So we were able to say, hey, this was written by Google. It was put into these non-exclusively licensed repositories. And boom. And so that got thrown out of court. You know, they're like, sorry, you didn't write this stuff in the first place. You don't have an exclusive right to it. So
that was thrown 16 years.
And that took about 9 years.
Oh, okay.
Okay. 7 years for that to loop through the courts, because they protested, they appealed, and then they turned their lawsuit then became about the Java headers that you need to interact with the Java program. And that Harmony was basically, it would use the headers and then they would implement their own implementation of those routines, those classes, those everything. And so that went to court, and we won. Then we lost on appeal. Then we won. Then we got kicked back by the Supreme Court down a level. Then we lost there. Then it got kicked up, and we won on appeal with Judge Kaplan. And then we lost above him in the federal, Ninth Circuit appeals. I don't even remember this point. Then we appealed to the Supreme Court on that one, because we're like, you can't possibly think this is a good idea. And then the Supreme Court, it went to the Supreme Court, and it was supposed to be decided in October of 2020. COVID had happened. So they're like, we're putting everything off. Then what's his name left and was replaced by the woman whose name escapes me.
Yeah.
Amy Coney Barrett. No. She came after Kavanaugh, right? So, yeah. So Kavanaugh goes in. We're like, and so we had a ruling based on 8. So we promoted the wrong word. We testified before the Supreme Court to 8 justices because she hadn't been seated yet. And then they pushed it off until March so that all 9 justices could review the case. And so we're like, we have no idea what's going to happen at this point,
Yeah.
And so, and then they came back and they said, no, this is actually fair use. You can't be expected to create compatible or even competing implementations of anything in computer science unless you're able to interact with them. So let's be clear. If this ruling was left to stand and it was the mid-90s or the mid-80s, Compaq would not exist. Phoenix BIOS would not exist. AMD could not exist. All of these, the entire PC revolution, which was using the ISA reference bus or the Phoenix BIOS that was based on the original BIOS that was in the IBM PC.
Or Socket 7 and all of the x86 compatible CPUs that came out of that. Or
any reverse engineering, basically, right?
Any reverse engineering. So that would be EMC, that would be Dell, that would be VMware. I mean, none of these companies could have existed, right? And so, and Oracle itself, they would owe significant money to other users and creators of the SQL standard that hadn't made it into a standards body, right? So this was a suicide note for the computer industry. And I have to tell you, I was not sure it would work out this way with the Supreme Court, but they ended up coming back with, frankly, a very reasonable ruling, in my opinion. So
I remember the day that ruling came down, there were a lot of fingernails being bitten on our Discord server that day among software developers. Like, it was kind of a tense moment that morning, waiting for that to happen.
And the thing is that you have to remember is that while Google is not loved by everybody, this was one of those things where the people who hated us, some people who really hate us and are competitive with us, and hate's probably the wrong word. Like, so for instance, Microsoft, they're extremely competitive with us, right? When it comes to hiring, when it comes to the cloud business, when it comes to the operating system business, you name it, they're a fantastic competitor. But they wrote an amicus brief in defense of reverse engineering and fair use in computer science. Same thing's true of a bunch of people who really dislike us or are really good friends with Oracle, right? So we had like this terrific spread of amicus briefs going into the case, like the EFF, which we have a rocky relationship as a company, but we managed to say, listen, what's good for all of us is for this case to get heard fairly for fair use. And luckily we won the day. But there were a lot of people who refused because they really didn't like us. Or maybe they truly felt that letting Oracle have control of all of computer science is a good idea, or whatever. So it's really something.
It's Brad, you look like a man with a question, actually.
Oh, no, go ahead.
No, he's thinking.
Yeah, he's thinking about what the world would look like if you couldn't write against other people's APIs.
It's over, man. The industry's over.
Well, sorry. Yeah, I mean, no, but it kind of.
I don't mean to be dramatic, but I mean, I really like working in computer science, but I guess I could become a farmer or something. I don't know.
Well, here, let me pluck a question from our bullet list that might usher you into that eventuality.
What would I do if I wasn't in computers? That's good.
Well, so we wrote down, one of the questions was, what keeps you up late at night? Like, is there anything that you live in fear of shipping or not getting right on a legal basis or in terms of licensing?
So I sleep really well, right? So good sleep's really important. I'm getting older. I'm almost 50. So like quality of sleep really matters to me. So I make sure that I don't go to sleep worried, right? So let me tell you the kinds of things that I don't worry about. So I'm convinced that at any moment, there's probably some compliance failure somewhere that I'm going to need to deal with. So what I try to do is I try to make it super easy for Google to get it right 99.999% of the time. And I try to make sure that my friends in computer science and open source know how to reach us for the 0.001% chance when we screw up, because we're going to screw up. And I can tell you something. What's really interesting about, because people are really afraid of lawsuits, they're really afraid of this, they're really afraid of that. And that fear can be somewhat useful in compliance. But what I would rather have happen is that we're compliant so much so that when we get to the borders of what is and is not compliant, that we can fix it very, very quickly and responsibly. And in the event that it's one of those cases where, we're actually not out of compliance here, we can educate the external complainant, right? And then people are like, why aren't you worried about going to court? And it's like, here's the thing. When you talk to judges, when you talk to lawyers, when you talk to these people and they say, okay, so let me get this straight. So this has happened, by the way. We've used a piece of code that we thought was under an open source license, but it turns out that the person who released it hadn't gotten permission from their employer to release it. So the employer found out that we were using this code after they had addressed it with their user and all the rest, because it was one of those things where it got put into our code base. under that open source license that we had no reason to think wasn't real. And then it ended up shipping in some product. And then they said to us, hey, we had actually never released that for reals. And we're like, okay, thank you for telling us. We'll rip it out. Right. And so we rip it out. The next over the air update or whatever it was, I don't think it was part of Android. It's part of something else. But, we took it out. And then people are like, well, this is a huge problem. Da, da, da. And I'm like, yeah, but is it? Because, when you talk to the Judge Kaplans out there, they go, so let me get this straight. You're suing Google. Okay. You're suing Google because they used some software of yours that you had released under an open source license. They had every reason to think that it was theirs to use. And when you told them to stop using it, they stopped using it. Why don't you get the hell out of my courtroom? I mean, that's the reaction from judges. They're like, it seems like they went. So what I tell people is like, we should go into this with the right attitude where we're going to respect the software licenses, what the software licenses say, not what we think they say, not what they feel they say, but what they say. And then if we need more or less, we just talk to the developer, and if we do that, we're going to be okay. And it's like when people are like, well, can I even read this stuff? Like an AGPL or whatever, or some blog post or some Stack Overflow post. I'm like, of course you can read it. Because if I go before Judge Kaplan and he goes, so let me get this straight. This company put the software up on their blog. I'm like, yeah. And you read it? Yeah. And you didn't copy it, but you learned from it? Yeah. Why are we here? It's like the courts are actually pretty clear about this stuff. It's very rare for them to say, well, Google should have known that they didn't mean that. I mean, that's not how the law works. Right.
That's changed a lot in the last 20 years, though, it seems like.
It hasn't, though.
Not really.
Yeah. So, a watershed moment in copyright litigation. I don't know if you guys care.
That's gonna be the title of this episode.
A watershed moment in copyright litigation was National Geographic versus like a zillion photographers. Okay. So what had happened was the National Geographic organization had taken like 50 years or 100 years of photos from the magazine. They put them on CD-ROM. Okay. And, they offered that CD-ROM to the outside world. Right. And now before this, there was no concept of photo rights for compilation as a photo data set on CD-ROM. Right. And so it went to court. The photographers union, or it was like one of these unions of photographers. They brought a case from all the photographers versus Nat Geo, and they said that they were owed for that compilation of photos from their photographers. And remember, these are like the best photographers in the world.
Yeah.
So the judge in the case, the first thing he did is like, it was really unusual too when he did this. He said, well, the important thing first is who's registered the copyright to these photos with the federal government. And only like maybe 30% of them had. And he's like, it seems to me that copyright's not important enough for you to register it. So get out of my courtroom. And he threw 70% of your complainants out of the case. And people are like, whoa, what just happened? So, and what happened functionally is he said to them, if the law is truly this important to you, you should follow all of it. And so,
but I thought with copyright, you didn't have to exert copyright in order to own the copyright.
And what's changed is you don't need to register with the federal government to have copyright. But before you bring a case, you register with the federal government.
Okay.
So that was like the big change there. But it was a really big watershed moment because for the people who remained in the case, they created a new kind of right that was attached to the photos. And I believe they got a pretty good award, probably proportional to whatever. But after that, what you saw were rights holding organizations going out there and securing all rights known and unknown for perpetuity.
Throughout the known universe. Yeah. It's a ludicrous phrase until you think about the fact that we don't have I don't know, Dazed and Confused isn't available to stream anywhere because they don't have the music rights for those streaming platforms because it existed before that was a thing.
Well, it's insidious, and it's Cory Doctorow would say, it's how we oppress culture. It's how we keep people from learning about culture that is not approved by our corporate masters. There's a lot of things, but it was a really interesting moment in copyright, and it presaged what would happen with Napster and the rest, where they're like, we have a new use, ha ha ha, you can't stop us. And it turns out, well, just because you came up with a new use doesn't mean you can't be stopped and have to consider copyright.
The interesting stuff, the interesting places that has happened. I mean, not recently anymore, but there was the startup that was renting antenna time to stream TV over the internet. You remember those guys? Sure. That was a good one. Like people are constantly kind of poking at the edges of this stuff to see what's going to fly and what isn't. Mm-hmm. And it seems like often it just ends up with being what judge you land in front of first is what determines the whole outcome.
Well, there's a lot of venue shopping. For sure. Like you see this in patent litigation with East Texas and the New Hampshire courts. But one of the things, the trickiest part is getting a really good defendant, right? So that you can take it to higher courts. So in the DVD CCA cases, the content
DVD CCA was the copy protection for DVDs.
Yeah. So there was a program called DCSS, which would take the content scrambling system keys. It would rip them, generate them, and provide them so you could basically take the content, the MPEG-2 content off of a DVD and play it and store it and copy it. Right.
I had a T-shirt with the code on the back.
Sure.
It was great.
I didn't have the tattoo, but I had the T-shirt, I had the book, I had all that stuff.
Yeah. The tattoo would be a little bit dated now, Chris. It's good that you didn't get that.
Yeah. And also, do I look like a kind of guy that tattoos?
Yeah, you never know, man. 21st century.
Like biker tattoos would probably work on me, but
you need a bike though.
I have an e-bike. I stuck like a motor on an old bike I had. So
that's not what we're talking about here.
Okay. Let's keep going.
Okay.
But so DCSS happened, right? And one of the aspects of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, Section 1201c3, said that not only could you not share this code, you couldn't share a link to the code, right? And so there were all these great lawsuits from this. Anyway, I don't know. I'm going off on a tangent, right?
Because that's
like 20
illegal.
Years ago.
Linking is legal as a result of the DCSS people messing up and putting that in the system.
Yeah,
right?
but it wasn't them, right? Because they lost in New York court. And frankly, 2600 was not a sympathetic client. So it would take another, 6 or 10 years before you'd have a sympathetic client. It was like one of the newspapers, one of the news organizations with their websites and the rest.
So I've got a pretty insightful question here from our Discord I want to throw at you, because you just mentioned Stack Exchange a few minutes ago, and Will just mentioned poking at the edges of things, and I have not heard this subject addressed before. I think this is pretty interesting. So this is from the Fish of Wisdom. What are the implications of copying and pasting answers from Stack Overflow being a widely accepted industry practice, considering Stack Overflow's content carries a viral Creative Commons by SA license? What should developers do to utilize Stack Overflow help responsibly?
Okay, so first of all, we released all of our documentation that touches on these issues at opensource.google/docs. Okay, so if you've got a company and you don't want to start from scratch on creating these policies, go there. All right, now let's talk about Stack Overflow. Stack Overflow, Jeff Atwood and Joel Spolsky created this thing. So they created this really great site for people to talk about coding, right? And so there's a lot of snippets that are extremely useful on this site. Some are a little old, some need to get updated, but they're all very useful. So originally, when they created the site, everything was by default accepted from the user and then re-released as CC non-commercial, NC. It was like version 2 at the time. And I have to tell you something. Non-commercial means Google can't use it. It means you can't use it in any commercial setting. And the number of people who actually aren't in a commercial setting, it's very, very low. Right?
Well, especially if they're re-releasing the software.
Well, this is the thing, right? It's, people want to use stuff on Stack Overflow in their programs. whether it's an app that you download from an app store or, honestly, there are a lot of university groups that I don't consider non-commercial at all. They're being funded by for-profit entities. They're making an enormous amount of profit from tech transfer and IP rights. So what do you mean by non-commercial? So I sort of consider non-commercial unacceptable for release or for consumption. Anyways, I wasn't alone. So Stack Overflow, I think it was about 2016. They said, everything is now BSD, but without even the acknowledgement clause. And everyone's like, what the fuck? And this stretches back into perpetuity. And
so they retroactively changed all of the answers on Stack Overflow to be accessible by everybody with basically no attribution and no share alike, whatever.
And here's the thing, right? Their terms of service before probably didn't allow them to do that. But the nature of the site was people sharing information for use. So when they decided to do this, they basically forced a change that maybe they didn't have complete and total rights to make. But from 2016 on, any contribution to Stack Overflow was under this new weird, not really great version of the BSD, but it's acceptable. And instead of counting on the intention of the people sharing information on Stack Overflow to be pure, now we actually have a proper license. So that intention is way more clear. Whereas the NC stuff, I mean, we had to tell people it's fine to learn from Stack Overflow. You can't copy from it. And if we find you doing it, we're gonna make you take it out, and I'm gonna ruin your weekend. You know?
So
when they did that, we were able to say, okay, I still want you to take anything you get from Stack Overflow and put it in our third-party directories so we can track it, but it's okay to use. It's okay to learn from, and it's okay to use. So
when you say like you can't copy it, does that mean you can't look at the code and then rewrite the code in a different way? Or does that mean you can't copy and paste it into your existing program or editor?
Control C, Control V.
Okay.
Right. So here's the thing. Depending on the language, when you read something and you re-implement it, it's going to look very, very similar. Right. But if you truly do not copy it, highlight it with your mouse, copy it, drag it over, Control C, Control V, whatever it might be, whatever your mechanism is. As long as you don't do H, T, T. I mean, as long as you really don't copy it, you really make it a new creative work, I'm cool with it. You can learn.
And this is a legal judgment, not a moral or.
That's right. But the trick is, I'm not being clever. I really mean it. Do not copy it letter for letter. Mm-hmm. Be inspired by it. Learn from it. Do not freaking copy it if you don't have a license to it, because I'm going to have to take it out.
Look, I think your rule on plagiarism and my 6th grade teacher's rule on plagiarism probably are slightly different. Maybe we might have to have you have a conversation with her.
Well, so here's the thing: the MLA standards for
MLA,
the Library Association.
Okay.
Yeah. So they have very specific standards on how you can copy information from a book, from a paper, from a movie, you name it, and indicate it in your paper, right? And aren't those just like our open source licenses? So long as you give credit, it's not plagiarizing. As long as you have rights to use it, it's not plagiarizing.
That is very true. I hadn't considered it that way before. It's
like I said this to my kids, and I'm like, it's always okay to take stuff and use it in your papers, so long as you give credit.
Quotation marks, very important.
And then because especially my daughter, when she was growing up, was when teachers were trying to figure out what Wikipedia was and how to use it in the academy and in elementary school and the rest. And sometimes they'd say ridiculous things like, "Don't use Wikipedia." It's like, what is she supposed to use? The Britannica? It's like, give me a break, And so I say, no, what you should do is you should use the best sources of information available to you, and you should credit them. And if you do that, you're always going to be fine. And that's the right way to go.
I think that's fair. I think that sounds exactly right to me. Brad, do you want to talk about games?
Yes, I have a question
games.
here. Yes.
I have a side project, So 5 years ago, I was running a process at work that would release intellectual property to employees. So they'd come up with some side project they want to do. Google doesn't care about it. So we came up with this mechanism where Google would tell people that they don't care, right? And they could have fun and all the rest. And it made a lot of engineers really happy. Okay. And I was running this process because somebody had to do it. And I was the open source guy. So they're like, make Chris do it. So I got an email from my old friend, Sam Mahatma. He said, Chris, I'll understand if you delete this email, but I got to do a video game. Can we do another video game? Because we had done a video game together before Google, and it was a disaster. We lost tons of money, and it was awful, right? And so I admit at this point, I got this email. It was like close to Christmas in 2015 or 2014. And I was like, yeah, I miss working on games. I miss the creativity, the story, and all the rest. So I turned around and I asked our head of conflicts, Andy Hinton, and our general counsel, Kent. I was like, I really want to work on this game. And they're like, yeah, it's fine. Just keep it out of Google. And I'm like, all right, thanks. Oh, okay. And so that was 5 years ago. So, okay. But now ask your question.
Yeah. So in light of your experience, I wanted to run this by you. A John Carmack tweet caught my eye recently. Okay, so here's his tweet. I'm just curious about your thoughts. He says, I always found it curious how so much of game development outside of low-level systems seemed fairly hostile to the ideals of open source. There is some aspect of business reality and some aspect of artistic ownership, but there is something else going on culturally as well. I was always disappointed that there weren't more serious open source uses of the Quake code, but I may be out of touch with the current state of things. Are popular mods often open source today? Are there any multi-million user games being actively developed in open source? Do you have any thoughts on why that is the state of things?
So there's a reason why I'm doing a game. Okay. So what games do is games take creative thinking, like stories and worlds and quests and arcs and narrative arcs and even visual creativity, and they turn them into a per copy sales model, right? So the beautiful thing about software licensing, non-open source software licensing, is you can charge per copy. Okay. Now, what games do is they convert the creative output of a group of people and turn it into software licensing revenue, and that's how you pay for that creative output. Okay. Game engines exist to help the game developer take that creative output and put it out there for people to use it. Now, so what about open source and open source games? So there have been open source games that have gotten somewhat popular, and there have been open source engines. The EdTech engine was under the GPL. The reason they chose the GPL is they knew that people who wanted to actually ship a game and get per license, per copy revenue would end up paying them for the non-GPL copy of its engine, because if they had to release their code, as the GPL would require, for their game as part of their release, then people would not be challenged by the game. They would have everything they needed from the game, and that was it. And you'll notice that the EdTech releases were only with that first initial map, right? If you wanted the rest of the WADs,
right?
This is where. And so what id was doing is, when it came to Quake, they were making money from the maps, the creative output. They had figured that out. That was their very first release with their shareware components. Like, you would get that first map for free, but every map after that you had to pay for, right? So, so John, frankly, understands open source licensing perfectly. He understands how to use it to turn it into per software licensing revenue. And if anything, the way he wrote that is really interesting, because he's like, I'm surprised that open source communities have not taken this and turned it into a Quake size revenue, Quake size impact on culture, right? And the reality is that the amount of work that goes into creating a Quake kind of game, or a Half-Life right? Which the first version of Half-Life was based on the id engine, right? And they paid id for that use. They didn't release their stuff as open source. Where was I going with this? Anyway, long and short of it is everything is working as intended, but building a game is expensive. It's really expensive to do that kind of creativity. And like, if you look at like Minecraft, right? It's like people are like, but Minecraft, you have all these mods, you have all this stuff, you have all this fun, and there's so much open source activity. And you're not wrong. It's not really open source because it's not really licensed like that. But if you actually dive deep on Minecraft, right? The core Minecraft code itself, a commercial, not open source project. If you look at the modding community with the eye of a lawyer, of a copyright bureaucrat like me, you realize they've reached the point in Minecraft where they're post-copyright. And what I mean by that is that there is no untangling possible. So it went from Minecraft, and then they ripped through Minecraft's code to create Forge, an external community, created Forge, and Forge was ostensibly under an open license. But they used so much code that they just ripped wholesale out of Minecraft that they can't really claim the rights that they have. Then people would take Forge and they would build all this stuff on top of it, right? And so, and they would share code back and forth and back and forth. It's really breathtaking. And the developer velocity and the love that went into these mods was terrific, right? And at the same time, no one had any rights to any of this stuff, right? And so they ended up using textures from each other. It became basically, it was a postmodern free-for-all. It wasn't open source. It was just postmodern. It was post-copyright. It was this weird utopia. And at its core was a commercial transaction for the original Minecraft Java client.
So as long as Microsoft keeps getting its cheddar for the Minecraft Java copies, they don't care what happens in the mod community.
It was funny because when Mojang was up for sale, I didn't think that Google wanted it, but I sort of, because I was enjoying myself, I went through the code of like the popular Forge mods and Forge itself and Minecraft, and I was like, oh yeah, no, whoever buys this just has to be okay with chaos, and saying that, you know what, the modding community de facto has the rights to do what they've been doing. We're not going to mess with them. And the rest. And what Microsoft did was kind of interesting. So they bought Mojang for $2 billion, whatever, and they were making a lot of money from the Java client individual sales, and they put a lot of time and a lot of money into the C++ PE version. Made a good amount of money from that. But what they were doing is there's an old sort of saying. It's not saying. It's kind of a joke, right? That Xbox only made money on Halo release years, and that was really true for like 10 years.
For a long time.
If they released Halo, they made money. If they didn't, they didn't, right? And so Minecraft was the chance to have another Halo project. Meaning more this kind of Halo, not that kind of Halo. Yeah. For the Xbox platform.
He pointed at his head, by the way. The
other Halo
and the rest. So it's a really interesting. I would love to talk to whoever kicked off that acquisition and see what was the motivation internally, what was the justification internally. But,
I always kind of assumed that the whole Bedrock thing that they did, where they unified all of the console and the Windows 10 native, not Java version, on one code base, was so that they could capture some of the chaos that was that Forge modding scene in a way that was, monetizable and repeatable.
And they monetize server infrastructure with that version as well.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I think that with Java now too, though, as well.
Okay.
Well, but the real, you can still get Java servers anyway.
Yeah, you don't have to, is the thing. Chris,
it's such an interesting place, that whole like morass of copyright.
Well, there's a weird. It's like the chaotic lands where some magic is happening inside. Anyway,
see, I thought you were going to ask about the John Carmack, but not Bethesda, is it? The ZeniMax lawsuit around the Vive sale. Not the Vive sale, the
Oculus stuff. Yeah, we can do that next time.
It was so interesting.
This is the real scene drama. We should head you on for the scene drama episode, man.
That sounds like an entire episode unto itself. Also, I didn't even get to the part where he followed that tweet up later by saying he wishes he had licensed Quake under BSD instead of GPL now.
Well, that's interesting. If he had really licensed Quake under BSD, more people would have used Quake.
That's exactly the conclusion he reached.
He would have kicked that platform out forever.
He did end that tweet, though, by saying my partners would never have gone for it.
Well, I mean, the reality is Unreal would be based on id Tech today. Frostbite would be based on id Tech.
Yeah.
All these things would be based on id Tech if that was the case. And you know what? He wouldn't have made a dime from it. And that's okay, because they always made their money from the games. Right? So.
And before we go real fast, I just want to ask Chris what his favorite Linux distro or distros are these days.
Slackware. No. I'm kind of I used to think of myself as a Debian purist, but I've been mostly using Ubuntu. The server side of it. I barely use the desktop interfaces anymore. So I guess my favorite Linux for daily use is Chrome OS. Because that's the one over there.
Party line, man.
No,
Party line.
It's the most reliable machine I own.
Are we quite at the point where you can, if somebody asks that question, you can be cheeky and say Windows at this point? Like, we're almost there with WSL now?
No, I mean, I think Windows is one of those operating systems. I don't want to look under the covers. I'd be afraid.
Sure. Fair.
I mean, so one of the people working for me is Jeremy Allison, and he's in charge of the Samba project, which is the file system server that's compatible with Windows. And that code base goes back 30 years now.
Oh, I am acquainted with configuring it. I know.
The thing you don't realize is if you look in the code of Samba, you see all the weird cases for Excel, for Word, for LAN Manager, IBM LAN Manager.
Oh yeah, I love LAN Manager.
Going back, I'm not kidding, 30 years. And so, like, Jeremy will go to conferences around the Samba file system, SIFs, I guess they call it when we're talking about the protocol. And commonly, he knows more about the underlying file systems than anyone from Microsoft. Everyone's retired, or left, and so they're like, "So, Jeremy."
Wow.
So it's like his reverse engineering has become the primary engineering form of that file system. It's wacky.
Yeah, I've run into numerous situations where you have to explicitly disallow older versions of SMB. Like, don't use older than version 3 due to all kinds of security holes and stuff like that.
Well, one of the things I also want to get in here is a plug for the game.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's talk about your game.
Since we brought up the game. So it's called Fractured Veil. We're going to be hitting Kickstarter on the 7th. Of September. So, and then it'll probably be for sale on Steam next year, But yeah, it's going really good. We're streaming like crazy.
What's the game? Chris? It's
set 100 years in the future on Maui. It's the future of survival MMO with elements of horror. And we honestly, we're so proud of like the crafting and building system. Well, the crafting is still a little rough, but the building system's incredible. You can make the coolest structures in the game.
I've seen the forts people build, and I mean, they build them at night. We're not going to talk about that, but like the construction stuff looks awesome. I can't wait to play it.
Yeah, it's super fun, and we've managed to get testing up to about 250 people per Unreal server backend world.
Ooh,
which is hard. We're really trying. So what we're trying for is full on 500 people per world instance. Which is because we have like these instance dungeons and other areas for separating the workloads, but it's fun, and we have a crazy lore. We've written like 400,000 words of lore. That's all.
It's too much lore, Chris. Well, way too much lore.
I needed to be creative, and through this science fiction-y, fun, cool story, we're able to do that. So.
That sounds awesome. Where can people can find Fractured Veil on Steam? They can find you at C. DeBona on Twitter?
Yeah, and everything. Yeah, C. DeBona.
Yeah, okay. Very good.
Yeah, but Fractured Veil is the game, and it's super fun. But Google is, that's where I work.
Chris, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you. We have now reached the portion of the show where we thank the patrons, Brad.
Thank you, patrons.
Thank you, patrons.
Thank you.
If you, as always, Brad and Will Made a Tech Pod is 100% listener supported. So if you would like to support the show and help us continue making the Tech Pod, you can by going to patreon.com/techpod for as little as $2 a month.
That's right.
$2.
$2.
I can't even get a cup of coffee for $2, Brad.
$2. That's like a $1 bill, except, I mean, it says 2 on it, but that's do
you know what's on the back of the $2 bill? I think it's the signing of the Declaration of Independence.
Is it really?
But I suddenly questioned myself.
Okay.
So let us know if we're wrong. If you are a patron, you can let us know we're wrong in this week's episode channel on the Discord. But for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the fabulous Tech Pod Discord, where you can talk to Brad and me, many of our illustrious show guests, and 2,700 and change other wonderful people.
That's right.
About topics of interest, including such things as
nuclear engineering. I saw there was a nuclear engineer weighing in on an episode last night.
Yeah. Also, there's a slight correction. The 3 Mile Island accident was not, in fact, caused by some of the things that we said. Anyway, you have to look in the Discord for the correction. I don't remember the specifics, so I don't want to mess it up again.
Yeah. But tons of interesting people. Point being.
Yeah. We even talked about Threads.
That's
last
right.
night.
Yes, we have Threads now.
Yes, Threads.
Turns out if you hit the big fat enable Threads button, it might not respect the permissions you thought you set to stop people from being able to create threads.
Look, it took people multiple hours to realize that Threads were enabled. Mm-hmm. That's all I'll say.
Yeah.
So anyway, thank you all for supporting the show, but extra special thanks to our executive producer tier patrons, including Andrew Slosky, The Bunny Fiend, Jacob Chappell, Joel Krauska, Twinkle Twinkie, David Allen, and James Kamek. And an apology to Andrew Slosky for mispronouncing his name for, I think, 6 of the 7 months that he's been an executive producer patron. So,
you fiend.
Look, it turns out pronunciating things is difficult.
It's true.
But that'll do it for us this week. If you have questions about software licensing or how I feel like I know a lot more about how software licensing works in Google now, which is kind of interesting because I had never really considered that they had to have multiple layers of process and ultimately some sort of emperor of open source code to figure that stuff out.
Yes, the licensing czar.
Yes. But yeah, we will be back next week with another episode of the Tech Pod. We will see you all then. Thanks for listening, everybody.